But you filled this out. You filled out the episodes.
I did.
Thank you. Sorry.
We're live.
We're live.
We're live.
We're live. Brian and I are here talking business and we're going live. Brian did some extra work on the show over the weekend, and I'm very appreciative. Brian, how are you?
I'm great, man. I'm good. I'm doing all right. It's Tuesday, July 5th. Um I've listened to a lot of Dave Matthews. I've talked about a lot of Dave Matthews.
Yeah,
My wife is singing a lot of Dave Matthews. My son is requesting more Dave Matthews. My whole house, my whole life, everything has changed in the last 10 days. It's absolutely wild.
it's true. It is a it's an all encompassing thing.
It really is. This little show that we're doing, this is our fourth episode, which for most podcasts usually takes you a couple weeks, maybe a month or so to get to that point. We're 4 episodes in, 1 week in. We're learning on the fly. We're figuring this thing out. It's called The Live Show because it's about live albums. It's about live releases within a band's larger catalog, but it's also the live show because it infringes on our lives in a lot of ways. It affects
Yep.
our lives in big ways, in ways that I don't even know if we're prepared for, and we're here for it. RJ, you've had a pretty wild, pretty good, pretty wild. I actually don't know the context, so I don't know how to even introduce this, but tell us about your morning. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. So I'm here at the beach until tomorrow, and this morning, if you have kids, you'll appreciate this story, and if you don't have kids, maybe it'll help you. But decided this morning that I'd take my kids to the arcade in downtown Stone Harbor. So put
Good
like
summer activity.
summer activity morning. Put $10 on everyone's little cards, and everyone's running around like playing games and you know having fun. And then we get to the part where we are like checking out, and you use your tickets to get like prizes, right? So my
Mm.
older daughter, the whole time she was playing to get prizes. She knew exactly what the game was. She was like,
She's old enough
I'm
to know, like, there's got
yeah,
to be a reward here.
I'm gonna accumulate as many tickets as possible. And then she got like some crappy sunglasses and like two other crappy plastic things. And our twins, who are 5.5, they basically didn't have enough tickets to get anything. And it was like 11:45. I had to get home to do this. And they're like, I want that, that, and that. And I'm like, there's not enough tickets, and I'm not gonna spend like $30 to buy you like a plastic toy. And it ended with my wife picking us up and me basically dragging them out of the arcade crying while my older daughter had like her sunglasses on and like was just like loving life. And we get in the car and they're just like bawling. And I'm like, wow, that was what a disaster.
The amount of emotions that we shed on both ends of the spectrum here, like the pride that your older daughter has of having sunglasses and the fury and anger and sadness that your twins have over entirely cheap Chinese plastic.
Yep.
It's an amazing thing because I remember feeling this as a kid. I remember being like, I got to get like 250 tokens to get that like little like monster that goes on your finger. Like I'm going to beat every single game, and then you get
Yeah.
it and like you lose it in 3 days.
Yep. And then it's over. I mean, it's
It's
ridiculous.
it's amazing with how much has changed in America that there still are arcades that are literally just scams for parents' money,
Yep.
and it's just a time suck for kids. It's an incredible summer activity.
It's amazing. And it was crowded and like getting the cards loaded up with money in the first place. Anyway, that's not what we're here to discuss today, but we are going to discuss a lot of other important life issues. But first, I do want to say we have a couple things going on. First of all, if you are a Dead and Company or Grateful Dead fan and you live in the Philly area, or if you're interested in going to see Dead and Company at Citizens Bank Park, that's next Sunday. We're doing a ticket giveaway through Osiris Social. The game is you guess you have to put in a submission about the Philly Fanatics' favorite Grateful Dead song, and we will be choosing a few people at random to win 2 tickets to see Dead and Company. And if you want to get tickets, you can go to osirispod.com/Philly. Another thing that we want to talk about. So in 2 weeks, on the 18th of July, we're going to be hosting a live event at the Ardmore Music Hall, and we have 3 amazing guitarists and a house band that we're going to interview the guitarists, and then they're going to play a bunch of music for us. Chris Forsyth, Tom Hamilton, Daniel Donato. It's going to be a lot of fun. We can tell you that if you go to osirispod.com/Osiris Live, you can get tickets for the Ardmore show. And I think that's it. Those are my announcements for now. But we'd love to see you at Philly Dead and Company, at Ardmore. We'd like to see you everywhere. So I just want to say that. What do you got, Brian?
We would love to see you there. I would say as well, we announced last Thursday an Osiris Live event that is going to be taking place the night before the Dick's Run out here in Denver. We have Taper's Choice, an incredible collection of artists and musicians that have come together. Dave Harrington, Chris Thompson, Alex Bleeker, most notably, have come together in the last 8-9 months and have played a collection of shows, and they've written some really wild songs. Their jams are super inventive. Dave Harrington, if you know anything about me as a listener, is one of my top 5 favorite guitarists currently making music. Chris Thompson plays drums in Vampire Weekend. Alex Bleeker is the bassist in Real Estate. It's really cool musical backgrounds to come together to play a bunch of great jams. And we're going to have them at the Larimer Lounge in Denver. We're going to sit down and do a quick interview with them, and then they're going to play a set of music. It'll be their first shows in Denver. And these guys have been killing it in New York City and LA and up and down the California coast. Read that link for me one more time, RJ, because we are live for from ticket sales, I think through the similar link as what you have.
Yeah, osirispod.com/Osiris Live.
Perfect. And those will be going on sale. Those are $15 leading up to the show day. So I'm really stoked about that. We're going to have a couple people from Osiris here for that. It should be awesome. And we got a couple other things in the works. There's more to come. This is the summer of Osiris. I'm very, very excited.
It's true. He's right. He's right, everybody. So speaking of the summer, because this show wasn't during the summer, but we're going to go back to almost summer, 1996. Can we get
Richmond
into that?
in April has to be summer. I want to say one thing really, really quickly. Just one thing. If you listen to this show on the podcast, you heard the debut of the theme song of the live show. I want to give a shout out to our good friend, our musical inspiration, Mr. Amar Sastry. He comes up with pretty much everything that we use here on the within the Osiris universe. He's an amazing songwriter. He takes whatever abstract ideas we have and says, "Hey, here's a theme song for you," and then we use it. It's great. It's killer. It's awesome. So shout out to Amar. But yeah, let's get to 4/30/1996. This is the earliest show that we've talked about here in the DMB catalog.
Yeah. And so we're talking about Richmond, Virginia. And Brian, I think, can give us a little bit of context, because in here you can hear them sort of like Dave mentions a few times that they're just getting back to playing shows. They took a break for a while. They have some new material. We're gonna get into it. But Brian, tell us about where this show takes place. Anything we need to know?
So this show takes place at the Classic Amphitheater in Richmond, Virginia, which is kind of an interesting amphitheater. It opened in 91. It was the only Virginia area amphitheater for a number of years. So it attracts a lot of artists that are coming through the East Coast. They're playing in Virginia. It becomes kind of this beacon of live music. But it had 3 main issues. It had 0 boxes for sponsors or any sort of like important VIP folks that are coming to shows that fund these sorts of events through box office purchases. It had a very small lawn, where a lot of amphitheaters are built with a smaller pavilion and a big lawn, so you can kind of pack people in at a lower rate for tickets. This had a kind of the reverse issue, so people were paying a premium to sit in the pavilion. Not as many people could get on the lawn. And one of the issues that plagues a certain number of venues around the country, and I really don't understand how there's not a workaround for this, but they had an area where you could buy and drink beer, and you could not bring beer into the venue, which just seems to like shoot venues in the foot almost from the gate, like from the jump. Like, how as a concert goer, you want to buy that beer, come back to your seat, enjoy that beer, enjoy some music, and then go back and enjoy some shows. So, or buy another beer at that point in time.
Yeah. Jones Beach is like that.
Is
I
it?
think because it's like a national park or a state park or something.
That's got to be the issue.
It's not great.
It's not great. I think the gorge has that issue up on like the lawn area. SPAC, for whatever reason, does not have that issue, even though that's on the state park. But as a result of it, the venue kind of falls off in the second half of the 1990s. Other venues open throughout Virginia. It books one act in 1991, kind of the brethren of the Dave Matthews Band in many ways, Hootie and the Blowfish, before they all went off into very different directions. It's kind of seen some reinvestment and was making a comeback pre-COVID. So it's a small theater in Richmond, Virginia, that Dave Matthews would play 3 years in a row here. This was their second time playing at the Classic Amphitheater in Virginia. Kind of their second home. It's like they grew up in Charlottesville. Richmond's right down the road. Go to Richmond and have a little bit more of a larger market. So that's where we are at this point in time for this show.
At one point early in the show, Dave says, "We have a new CD out. We hope you all got to check out our new CD," which just reminds me, we keep going back and forth between the ages. For some reason, I'm interested always in talking about like what's happening in music at this point, and not just technology. Like we're pre-streaming. He said we just made a new CD. We hope you guys like it, and if it sucks, play it a few more times. Which is a funny thing. And we'll hear a bunch of songs that were new then, which end up being classics for them. But what else was happening in '96? I mean, we can talk about the bands that we like, what they were doing in '96. But is there anything more broadly we need to know about the spring of 1996?
So on this day, Howard Stern's radio show debuts. In addition to this,
No shit.
at
His
this,
first one?
I don't know if it's his first one, but I think it was his most recent prior to Sirius XM that had debuted at that point in time in
Wow.
Massachusetts. From a Billboard chart standpoint, it's kind of wild. Three divas are dominating. We've got Mariah Carey's "Always Be My Baby," Celine Dion's "Because You Love Me," which came from a really just like sappy movie with I think Robert Redford and Michelle Pfeiffer from like the mid '90s. And then I don't know if you necessarily can call her a diva, but like I just threw it in. Alanis Morissette's "Ironic" is in the top 5 at this point in time.
All right.
Which Jagged Little Pill is like the biggest album in America at this point, which really puts this in context. Like this is 1996 America. I have memory of buying 2 CDs during this era. Do you want to hear what those 2 CDs were?
I do.
This is the era where you have to buy a CD because you like a single, but like
Yep.
I'm coming out of 5th grade at this point in time, so like this is what I was listening to for some reason. Duncan Sheik put out a single called "Barely Breathing" that apparently really connected with me as like an 11-year-old kid. And the Verve Pipes put out the song "The Freshman," which that's a classic song. It holds up. It's really relevant nowadays. And the album doesn't totally, but I loved that song.
Okay. The Verve, as in the same Verve that did Bittersweet Symphony?
Different. This is the Verve Pipe.
The Verve?
Verve.
Not even real.
I think they have like 2 albums, but this was their first, and this was a song I really connected with. My mom drove me to Best Buy, and she was like, "Why are we buying this album?" I played it on the way home. She was like, "I don't really like this music," but I made money lawn mowing, and I bought some records.
That's awesome. I'm proud of you for buying music at that age. Most people were not, but we know that people who follow music closely and end up loving music get started early.
Had to have CDs.
I don't. For people listening to the podcast, this is going to seem like a slight diversion, but I just have to take the bait on this comment from John, who says, "RJ, I love you," and thank you, John. I love you too. But Goose is a pop band? Question mark. Saw them at Peach and they blew my mind. But pop, interesting. I don't think they will be on pop radio. So here's one thing. I saw that "Slow Ready," one of the songs from their new album, Goose's new album, is at the top of Spotify's Ultimate Indie playlist right now, which is a huge thing for them. So they're
Huge.
already, I mean, that doesn't really answer your question, John, but or address your comment, but they're already getting indie love, and I think like a song like Slow Ready, it's got catchy lyrics, it's got a hook, it's in the album version is designed for, you know, people who like to listen to 4 or 5 minute songs, and it's an earworm like a lot of their songs. And to me, like that's the definition of pop. You know, they're writing verse, verse, chorus, verse, bridge, chorus. Like they're doing that, and they're doing it uniquely and differently. And the fact that they're getting love from like the indie community, I think pushes it further toward pop. But pop radio, it's a good point. Like they won't be on. You won't hear like, you know, I don't know, Cardi B and an old Britney Spears song and then Goose on pop radio. I just mean pop in terms of the way they construct their songs and the way they tap into different influences, including a lot of the lyrical kind of like the auto tune and the stuff they're doing with the vocal arrangements on a lot of these songs. So I guess that's my explanation, but probably not on pop radio in a classic sense, John. So thank you for the comment. Although we might be here to talk about Goose someday on this show, but we probably should get back to Dave Matthews just so people don't ditch us. Unless you want to respond to that.
Well, I think it's a really interesting point based on this specific episode. Because I was listening to this show. This is the crash release party, as you were hinting at earlier. And it's really wild to listen to this concert in conjunction with live track 7, which we will be talking about next Tuesday, which is the 12/31/1996 show, the year finale. And there's a moment in that show where Dave talks about, like, I think it's right before, I haven't listened to that album yet for this series, but I've listened to it in the past. I think there's a moment right before they play Crash Into Me where Dave talks about, like, this has been a huge year for us. And I think it's really interesting to talk about, and it's fascinating that we've got like Goose fans invading this specific podcast. Like it's amazing to me because where Goose is right now and where they're at with Dripfield being released and with songs hitting like high up on the Spotify charts, and there's a lot of interest beyond the jam band community around Goose. Dave Matthews is dealing with that exact same thing with Crash. Crash is a really accessible but really interesting album. There's a lot of layers to that record. There's a lot of really cool moments. Number 41, Say Goodbye. There's a lot of like cool production choices that Steve Lillywhite, who's putting this record out with Dave Matthews Band, and is going to put Billy Breathes out with Fish 6 months later, is doing. Like, there's an argument to be made that Crash, Billy Breathes, Before These Crowded Streets, and now Dripfield are like in this lineage of some of the best work that jam band artists post 70s Grateful Dead could do in a studio. And I
just
think,
want to take a moment to acknowledge that segue from Brian. I mean, that was just, you couldn't have scripted that. So thank you, Brian, for bringing us. It's a really good point. I hadn't actually thought about that, but it's a great point. And thank you for articulating that. But keep going if you have more.
Well, I just think like to kind of close the loop, and I appreciate that. That's a nice tip. And thank you everyone for coming to the potential future Goose live podcast. Well, I'm wearing my TED hat. This was not planned today, but shout out. I bought this a year ago before Dripfield came out. All right. I was in on it before.
Yeah.
But I think there's a really interesting place. I was actually talking with one of our close friends, our colleague, about where Goose is going. And I think there's a really interesting couple of paths for them. And if you look at Dave Matthews from here in 1996 to where we saw them last week in 98, 04, and 2000, of is this band going to kind of be glommed onto by the larger industry and kind of pushed towards pop success, or are they going to retain this kind of experimental side? Because they have both of it going for them really, really well right now. And where Dave Matthews is in 1996, I don't know if it's directly comparable to where Goose is at right now, because the music industry is just so different. And I don't think that like Goose necessarily has a Crash Into Me on Dripfield, but there is that push and pull of experimentation or mainstream success that Goose is facing in a way that I don't really think any jam band faced since Dave Matthews Band.
That is great, and I think a lot of the people who are commenting agree. I think it's interesting that yeah, and concert vids. I would think Crash 96 and Dripfield 22 and the years they drop are very linear. It's really interesting. I just sorry, this will be our last thing. Concert vids said earlier. This is something that I'm seeing a lot from friends, like indie friends who don't like jam bands. I have a neighbor whose wife, like we went to Mexico with her, and she tolerates fish, I guess, but she like is like obsessed with Goose. Not like I like going to the show. She's like it's all she listens to now. I just think that's interesting that there are people who are being brought into this I don't know environment or whatever without really any connection to other jam bands. So okay, should we talk about this show? This is a very interesting topic, but I like it. Yeah, what else do you have before we go into it? Because I think that now we know that the release of Crash and the release of Dripfield are connected cosmically, linearly, and as Brett Wooden said, Dave is a huge inspiration to Rick, so it ties in. So I think we're there.
I think we're there. I think that we hear the crossover there and the opportunity. So I have a couple thoughts about this show before, like as we're jumping into it. Like I think we can kind of set the table and jump into the show. But I'm curious, like I want to ask you, like we did 3 shows last week. We were in a 98 show and a 2000 show that I think we both agreed were fascinating. Like that to me, that 98 show was like, that is my zone so far for Dave Matthews Band. And the 2000 show, I thought from a set listing standpoint, from a playing standpoint, was outstanding. The 2004 show was totally new territory for me. I thought it was really interesting. This is the classic period for Dave Matthews Band. So I'm curious, after a week of doing this, of kind of for both of us dipping our toes into areas that we hadn't necessarily spent much time in from a Dave standpoint. What were your thoughts on going back now to like Dave playing that very thin guitar, like way up high, like pajama pants with dress shoes, like the band like is not decked out in like linen shirts, like they look like a ragged college band still if you look at pictures from 96. Like what were your thoughts going back to this, and how did that like inform your listen going into it?
I mean, I think it's like a much in terms of the sound, like it's a much simpler and more like stripped down sound you get from the band in 96. It does sound a little bit more like a you know college band. I guess the one thing that I read on antsmarching.org, in addition to hearing many new songs for the first time, fans in attendance were the first to hear the new sound system that DMB had recently inherited from the Grateful Dead. It helped take DMB's live show experience to the next level. I just think that's interesting because I thought this sounded more like it sounded like a lot thinner, like you said. Maybe they were still kind of like, you know, they obviously had just started using the sound system, and a lot of the songs are not they're just simpler, you know, especially the ones that were new at this time that we would then hear jammed out in lots of different future formats. But you have a lot of like 5 to 6 minute songs, which I think as DMB moves on, you get more of the 10 to 12 or even longer. There's one in here that's longer, which we'll talk about, but I think it's a much simpler sound. Dave's voice is interesting. I didn't really anticipate that Dave's voice would be like different back then.
Yeah.
It's like it's less polished, I think. Like his singing is less polished, but it's also like really like on Say Goodbye is like the screaming and it's really like very authentic and awesome. Whereas I think later he gets a little more polished with his voice. So I guess that was mostly like less polished, but really kind of raw and emotional in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with you on all of that. Like I think the Grateful Dead lineage is really fascinating, and you know we'll talk about this a bit in tomorrow's episode. But like this era they're still feeling to me like they're a part of the Grateful Dead lineage in a lot of cases, in a way that like they strike me as a band that kind of broke out of that and became more of a pop act, and then like kind of retained that jam band legacy. But 95, Dave plays one of my favorite Grateful Dead covers of all time. His performance of Eyes of the World a few days after Jerry's passing is just an absolutely stunning performance, and it always blows me away. But like to have them inherit the Grateful Dead sound system, it feels kind of like we talk in 20 summer 2022 of torches being passed. It feels like a nod of like, hey, you guys are doing something that we really approve of, and here's you guys take on the sound system that worked for us. It's interesting to me. I'm going to make a very bold claim right now, as we're getting into this. I think, as someone who I would say, like, I have a decent understanding of Dave Matthews Band's evolution through Busted Stuff, and then from there, I'm totally, just to clarify again, totally learning on the fly. But I think their peak was 98 to 2000 in a lot of cases, and this to me sounds like, if you want to make like an athlete comparison, like this sounds like the year before the leap, where like you start to hear the hints, you start to see what's happening as this band is both tightening things up, but also as this band is, kind of putting themselves in a position where they're taking a lot of risks, where they're taking a lot of challenge. They're starting to take risks on stage, but they've recorded this really solid album. They're playing this album out as much as possible, and they're taking this energy that has really worked in a bar theater standpoint, and they're starting to blow it out to amphitheaters. And within a year, they're going to be at a totally different level. But where I hear this band is kind of like taking that step at this point in time.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and let's talk about the tracks a little bit. I mean,
Yeah.
I mentioned the Say Goodbye, particularly Dave's singing, but Two Step, Say Goodbye, and then this Richmond Jam, which as named by the band, and it was just sort of like Dave kind of riffing on being in Richmond and playing music. That's what I took away from that. Is there anything else to it that I missed?
No, I think it's pretty straightforward in that standpoint. I think it's really interesting. I think it's an interesting kind of like diversion early on in the show. Um, I think ultimately the thing that's most notable to me is like you get 11 of the 12 tracks from Crash here, so those really define the set list. And to still have a moment where the band goes from Say Goodbye into a jam with some kind of scouted lyrics, it shows, like what I was just saying, like the risk taking is there, even though like they're playing pretty straight and trying to like nail these songs live.
Yeah, yeah. There's a bunch of stuff that comes in pretty early on. So too much, so much to say, crash into me. Um, it's really, I mean, good performances of these songs, and clearly a lot of these songs are new. But man, when I was listening to Crash into Me, I mean, the song is just so powerful still to me, like 30 years after I first heard it. Like, is Dave one of the best ever at writing love songs? Because like
I
almost
think in
every
this era he is.
he is, right? I mean, like every song is kind of, not every song. A lot of the songs are kind of love songs, but he's really good at writing them. They're not like straightforward in terms of being like too, I don't know. They're not like too sappy. They're not too like, I don't know. They're really pretty awesome songs. So that was one of my thoughts. But another thing that I saw here is there's number 41 is a newish song, and Dave actually talks about that being new. And first of all, it's like 7 minutes, which I think we've talked about before, even in some other versions of it, like from other years, are like 15 minutes or longer, and they end up being the jam of the show. And this is really like just a run through of this song. But I noticed in some of the early other live tracks that take place later on, we've talked about this a few times, but like everyone goes nuts when number 41 starts. And here you can kind of hear that you can tell it's kind of a new song. It's like nobody really knows what's going on. And I guess I was thinking about this while I was listening to number 41. Just it's like, the response was kind of muted, and clearly people were giving the new material a chance, and eventually a lot of these songs would turn out to be classics. But I've always been fascinated with how artists mix in new material with older songs. Some artists, like more mainstream artists, will just go and play a show of all new songs, right?
Yeah.
And some of the bands that we know and see a lot, I think they sprinkle in, I guess, when you're more focused on the live show as opposed to being like an album focused band, you can kind of you can just sprinkle in new material. But this is pretty heavy new material without really going overboard, I think. But I don't know, I'm curious about your thoughts on like the balance in the show between the new material and old material.
Yeah, I was thinking about that a lot because I think like 4 volumes into this, what has really blown me away and what has really been like the aspect of the band that I've been most interested in is kind of the surprise. Let's dip back into the recesses of our songwriting. Let's showcase a rarer song in a really prime slot in the show. Let's kind of blow out these songs like number 41, like Seek Up. And I was listening to this show and I enjoyed it, but I was kind of like, it feels like a very, very much of a run through of new songs, which makes sense based on the fact that this was the Crash release party. But it made me wonder why this got a release, especially this early in the series. Like there's a couple notable things. We talked about the Grateful Dead sound system, which changes the dynamic of the band's overall playing. Obviously, the Crash release party is a huge, huge moment in the band's overall career. And as the DMB Almanac states, the great thing about the show is that it catches the band at a really interesting point in their development. You can still hear the raw energy that the live show is known for, but also start to hear the polish of a veteran band that is completely comfortable in their surroundings. And I was thinking about all that with the dynamic of like this set list is something that if you're coming to the show just kind of out of curiosity, you're being overwhelmed with a lot of new songs. And it made me wonder, like, I saw the majority of my Dave Matthews shows in 2001, which is coming off of this period we talked about in our last episode where they write all these incredible songs for the Lily White sessions. And then there's this crash course with Glenn Ballard. They release every day. And so much of the summer 2001 shows are dominated by them trying to force feed these everyday songs into their set list and to, this grand reception from their community where they'll play Angel for like 13 minutes. And it's really just kind of like a big blues song, but like, hey, we're going to like blow this out like we've blown out other songs. And I was thinking about this show, like, I think being in attendance, it had to be, these are all great songs. And these are all songs that are going to, for the most part, live in the Dave Matthews set list. But for me, listening 28 years later, 26 years later, I don't know, 26 years later, I think, I was like, this is a lot of Crash. And this is a lot of Crash played straight to the overall album that as a live release, I don't know how much it's aside from like all the context that you learn, like, I don't know how much like I'd throw this release on just knowing that it's a ton of Crash in a very short amount of time. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think I just put in a comment on the screen here about some of the Crash songs, like Too Much. I think this was probably like the 15th or 20th time they played Too Much, but So Much to Say it was being played since 92. And some of these songs had been played a lot before this. And maybe the previous comment, like they were played more like the album versions in this show and shows around the time, which makes sense. I mean, I think the like number 41 and So Much to Say and Too Much, they all sound like pop songs at this point. They sounded like they were practicing them or had rehearsed them like for an album, it's funny to hear these interesting songs like number 41 and Lie in Our Graves that are in later years like big jam vehicles, big for like for DMB, and they're just sort of like tight versions that are much more focused on the song structure. I'd sort of like after the first 3 live tracks, I'd sort of gotten used to them stretching out a lot of these songs, and this show, and maybe it's because it was an album release party. I'm not familiar enough with the rest of the '96 tour, but I will find out. You know how much this is an anomaly, and how much these were like just playing these songs through after the release of the album. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pulling up the 96 New Year's run because there's the show obviously from 12/31 that we're going to talk about, and that has some pretty significant jams on it. Now, granted, that show has a ton of sit-ins from the entire Bela Fleck and the Flecktones band, but you've got a 14-minute Seek Up. Two Step by this point in time is almost 11 minutes. Number 41 stretches to 15 and a half. Typical Situation goes into a jam, but like, you've got these songs that like are going to be played out in a way. And I think that, we're on the cusp of them realizing, we're on the cusp of them realizing what the potential of a song like Number 41 is, which to me is like, we talked about this in episode 1. That is my favorite Dave Matthews song. That is a song to me that like it fuses everything that this band does so well, which is mix kind of dimly lit, kind of mercurial lyrics and storytelling that you can't totally figure out, that like could mean one thing to you and a totally different thing to me and a totally different thing to the songwriter. You may not even know what the song is about and it sounds fascinating, but then, you've got Leroy Moore's sax really dominating it. You've got Stefan, you've got Carter connecting in ways that like really hold down this rhythmic section that allows the song to open up. And hearing it in this setting, as Tyler Hensley, you just had this comment on, it's a live tracks I very rarely, if ever, revisit. It kind of, to me, feels like a moment where the band is saying, hey, we have this new release series. Let's put out a show that was really important to us, but may not teach us a ton about the band just on like a surface level listening.
Yeah. And another comment here, just that most of the Number 41s without a guest in this year were 7 minutes, which makes sense. So what else? I mean, what other? Go ahead.
I was just gonna say it's wild that like in 2 years that's a 20-minute song.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I think the Jimmy thing is, I think right before that he says we're gonna play an old song now, and 15-minute jam, really cool, but like really I don't want to say like basic jam, but I enjoyed it quite a bit. I thought it was really fun, but it was very straightforward, in a good way. I think that's just another thing with these shows in this time period, just like really kind of like raw sound, which I think is great. What were some of your highlights from the rest of this? Because I think this show kind of like dips off a little bit after the Jimmy thing. And in typical fashion, there's like a 4-song encore, which is great. But what did you think of that sort of last quarter? I guess like the Ants Marching, Proudest Monkey, Satellite, Cry Freedom, Drive In, Drive Out. They were kind of all back to back, and felt like the energy dipped a little bit. But curious about your thoughts.
I agree. And I'm trying to do this thing where when I listen to these shows, I don't look at the set list at all. Like you pull up on Nugs and you see the first 3 songs, and I'm trying to just like go into this as blind as possible to just get like as pure of an experience as I can. And by the time I kind of got to this last section, like we'll talk about it here in our awards segment, like I found my bathroom break finally where I was like, okay, like I know where to go. But I thought Ants Marching is only 6 minutes and 40 seconds. That was one of my absolute highlights of the overall show. There's so much energy, and you can really hear the band at that point. There had to be so much building up to this day when this album is released. They're in the studio with Lily White. Steve Lillywhite at this point in time, he's 15 years past producing the first 3, U2 records, and he's done a ton of work throughout the late 80s and early 90s. Like, he's a really respectable name from a production standpoint. There's a lot of money behind this record. There's Crash Into Me, the song itself, that I'm sure once the label heard it was like, okay, that is being pushed to every radio station for the summer. There just had to be a ton of logistics in this, and for the band to then come out and play 11 of the 12 songs, there seems like a sigh of relief when they get to Ants Marching, because it's just, it's one of the songs that broke them. But at this point, there's no pressure on Ants Marching anymore. They don't have to play it, but they love playing it, and it's got this infectious groove, and it's got this like connective piece for all members of the band to shine every single time they play it. The lyrics to Ants Marching are kind of like, they kind of summarize the global perspective of this band in terms of like what their message is, how they communicate themselves artistically to the world. And the latter section, where you get Boyd and Leroy and Carter kind of all going back and forth, it just like, I re-listened to it after, the first time I was going through it, and it just really hit me. But what about you? What about, like, did you find that in Ants Marching? Did you find it any time later in the show?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, like listening to these shows, I hear it mostly through Dave's voice. Like he's right, like you can tell when
Yeah.
he's, and in all these live tracks. I mean, they're clearly like important releases for the band for different reasons, or for Dave and the band. I think it's pretty cool at this point. They are kind of like out of this kind of. I mean, you can hear it in the crowd too. Like they start to get a little more loose, and I think the crowd is more receptive to like once they start mixing in the older songs. So I mean, given that it was like an album release show, it's people knew what to expect, but it was a little bit of a release, I think, and the crowd starts to like get a little bit more into it at that point. Although according to the show flow chart, there are many dips after this, but I think the ants marching was sort of a little bit of a peak in the show.
Yeah, we see some dips like you're talking about right after Ants Marching that kind of like dries. Like, there's some good moments, but like overall, I think song selection wise, it seemed like they were, at least from a listener standpoint, they were not selecting the most chosen songs from a set listing standpoint. I think that's putting it nicely. There's two songs that dip way below zero at this point.
Well,
Um,
yeah, what was your sort of what was your highlight of this part?
Honestly, I was really stoked to hear Cry Freedom, even though I felt that the speech beforehand kind of like perfectly summarized where we were at, from a worldview standpoint in 1996, where like, as long as we had like cool faces everywhere, as long as we had people that we like gave shout outs to, like we were doing enough. And like, there's a very kind of tepid speech in favor of Nelson Mandela before they go into Cry Freedom. But I think it's a really powerful song. I'm a huge sucker for Drive In, Drive Out, and I think that it just like really showcases Carter Beauford in a really nice way. Typical Situation, I'm really stoked to hear every time they play that, and I thought the Trippin' Billy's ending was really fascinating. One thing that I'm just like pulling it up right now, because on a few other releases, so it looks like Watchtower gets a 1 on the show float, but I've noticed in a few of our earlier releases that we talked about last week that Watchtower was getting docked some points. And I'd really be curious, like anyone in the audience listening, what your thoughts are on Watchtower, because that was one of the initial draws for me of this band, and it's still like a highlight every time I hear it. It's just there's so much power to that song. But I'd seen on like our first few episodes that we did that dipped a bit in the show flow. So I don't know if that was just like a one off. The performances weren't very strong, or if there's a perception in the community that maybe it's overplayed or it's kind of redundant. Brett Wooden just said it's overplayed. I guess that's all it is. It's you can have a great song and you can play it too much. What are your thoughts, RJ, on their take on the most the heaviest covered song in rock history?
I mean, nothing really.
It's kind of like getting a 0 set closer for Fish. That's it. That's it. It was
Yeah,
one of those things that like drew me in as like a 13-year-old when I was first getting into Dave Matthews. That was like, oh my God, not only do they cover Watchtower, but they like play it quiet and then it gets really loud.
yeah,
And I guess that probably loses its luster over time.
yeah, yeah. It seems like it. And they're, it's interesting because that song is like it's really meant to be used sparingly. Um,
You would think.
you know. Um, well, we got to get into our awards because we got to get people back to their days. I don't know. I'm still like with my family. I don't know if people are working today or if it's like still a holiday or if it's like in between. I can't really tell. I'm sort of confused about
It's that time
what's
of
happening
summer where
today.
time is just like, it just,
That's true.
who knows?
That's true. That's definitely part of it for sure. Should we talk about the awards?
We should. Um,
Do you want to go?
I'll go. We've
Okay.
got our bathroom breaks,
Yeah.
which, to be honest, I kind of struggled over this one compared to episodes last week. I kind of knew where I was going to take my break in previous episodes, or as in the Thursday episode, I wasn't going to take a break at all because the show was so good. This one was Proudest Monkey. It's about 10 minutes. It's not my favorite Dave Matthews song, and that's being complimentary. And I was kind of like, all right, Ants Marching just rocked my world. I'm going to go take a break and I'm going to come back and I'll be back in time. I'll probably miss Satellite and I'll come back in time for Cry Freedom post speech. And I'll be there for the encore. What about you?
Yeah. I mean, that's a good call. Yeah, I think it's hard. Like after the long Jimmy thing jam, I think that's like a good time to take a break. But the ants marching is a nice kind of like commitment. So I guess I'm probably going at like in the middle of ants marching so that I can be back and see what happens next. But I probably should. That's what I would do, but I probably should do the same thing that you're doing. So I think you
Let's
made the
just
right choice.
go hang out. Let's go get, some food. You
Right.
can get a beer. I'll get a lemonade and we can
Yeah,
make it back to our seats in time for the
that
encore.
sounds
I'm glad
great.
I'm glad that like my assumptions, Tyler, thank you. Proudest
Yeah,
Monkey is always a
it's nice.
bathroom break
You're
song.
you're 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 on it, man.
I
Okay.
also have to say, sorry, really quick. I
Yeah,
know
yeah,
we're running
please.
up against time, but the speech before Proudest Monkey, I'm just remembering it. That to me, it reeks of 1996 like centrism. This idea of I wrote this song because I thought we came from trees, and I like that better than the idea that we came from a creator. But now I think about it as like the band's grown, and I was just kind of like, man, like just play the song, like, just play the song. Um, what did you have? Who did you have as the MVP of the show?
I mean, I think it's I feel like this is becoming a pattern, but I think it's got to be Dave because to go and put these songs out there and to have an album release party. I mean, that's fun, but it's also like you were saying earlier. I think a pretty stressful situation, and I think his singing and some of the kind of structure of the show was really great. And I assume it was a pretty amazing night for them. So I'm going with Dave.
I'm gonna pivot from the doc because I initially put Dave, and just to add some color to this, like I agree with everything you just said. I think that like so much of what makes this show successful is his songwriting has reached a level where it's about to hit the zeitgeist of the culture. Like this
Hmm.
is this is about to overtake not just the jam community, but this is about to like get to places where there are people who own the Crash CD, and that's the only Dave Matthews CD that they own, and they've never attended a Dave Matthews concert, and they've never even thought about attending a Dead & Co concert, let alone a Fish concert. Like they have never stepped foot in this, and they own the Crash CD. It's one of those records from the 90s that I'm sure it's at a lot of used CD stores.
Yeah.
Similar to my first CD purchase of all time, which was REM Monster, which is you can probably buy like for 50 cents at a used CD store at this point in time. But I'm going to go with someone who I haven't mentioned, and I've tried to avoid mentioning for some pretty sincere reasons. But I think that this is the peak period for this member of Dave Matthews, and that is Boyd Tinsley. Like, to me, the least appealing aspect of Dave Matthews shows is the violin solo. We talked about this offline with our good
Mm-hmm.
friend Matt Dwyer, who will be a future guest on this show as we dive deeper into the catalog. That said, like, this is the time period where, like, when Boyd rips it up, as he does in like Ants Marching, it has a profound effect on the song, and it has a profound effect on the impact that the song has and the show has on the audience. He's all over like the Live on at Red Rocks release that was recorded about 10 months earlier, and he's all over this. And so if I'm going to give him any sort of a pat on the back, it's going to be at this era of Dave Matthews Band, where like the band just sounds like they're not, like, Leroy is not fully taken over the jamming of this band. This is,
Yeah.
can Dave and Boyd connect, and can Boyd throw out a great solo?
Yeah. I think that's totally fair. Okay. All right. We have to talk about the jam.
We do.
And then we're going to let everyone get back to their day. So what's the jam for you?
To me, it's the jam.
Mm-hmm.
The Richmond Jam. It's a cool, surprising moment early in the show. You know, I considered Two Step just because it's a live Trax debut, but I loved having this like moment of improvisation, and you know, this moment of kind of creativity in a way that kind of shocked me early on. It kind of reminded me of the best parts of the first and third volume that we talked about last week, where it felt like the band like segmented the opening of the show and then played you into the remainder of the show. It was cool. What about you?
I think the Jimmy thing, you know, just like long jam, I think really kind of tight, but also like pretty cool to hear. So I'm going with the 15-minute Jimmy thing. So Brian, tomorrow we're going to be back again. We're going to be talking about Live Trax 5, which is from 1995. So we're going back a little bit further, which I think will be fun, because there's some songs on there I think that we haven't heard yet on Live Trax, and so I'm excited about this conversation tomorrow. We'll be back at 12 o'clock tomorrow for those of you watching, and for those of you listening. Thank you for listening and for sharing and for hanging out with us. Anything else we need to say, Brian?
No, I'm really excited about this. This is 8 days after the Red Rocks performance. This is Dave Matthews at like a very, very cool period in time. And I've listened to this show. There's some really cool moments. I'm excited to dive into this with you.
All right. Well, then we're going to be back tomorrow at 12. Thank you guys for tuning in. Thanks for listening. And we'll see you all tomorrow.
See y'all soon.
Peace.